So, picture this, it's 2025 and a report about the future of AI just drops, and it lands like a bombshell. It's called AI 2027, and it's not your typical academic paper. No, this thing tells a detailed month-by-month story of how we could get to superintelligence, and it backs the whole thing up with what looks like some seriously sophisticated data modeling. And, as you can imagine, it went viral. Fast.
And when I say fast, I mean really fast. The authors themselves were blown away. Almost 1 million people hit their webpage. They were giving talks at Harvard, at OpenAI. This wasn't just some random blog post floating around. People, I mean very smart people, were treating this as a serious, rigorous forecast of our future.
But that, right there, is where our story really kicks off. Because hiding underneath that incredibly compelling narrative and behind all those impressive-looking graphs, a huge question started to bubble up. What if the very foundation of this prophecy, the code itself, was, well, broken?
Okay, so let's get into it. What was the secret sauce here? What made AI 2027 so ridiculously compelling? Well, it was this really unique blend. On one hand, you had a science fiction-style story from the well-known writer Scott Alexander. But then, you bolted on 5 appendices of what looked like super detailed research. And to top it all off, a public code base. You could actually go look at their work. And this is what really set it apart from everything else out there. You know, your typical AI story is just that, a story, speculative fiction. But AI 2027 framed itself as a plausible forecast. And where other predictions are always super vague on timelines, this thing was specific, down to the month. But the real kicker, the thing that made everyone take it so seriously, it had that technical backing. It pointed to its code and said, here, check our work. It brought receipts.
So all that scientific-looking stuff, it caught the eye of a blogger and computational physicist who goes by the name TwoTotal. And they decided to do what apparently very few other people had done. They actually dug into the 300 lines of code driving the whole forecast. And what they found, well, let's just say it wasn't pretty. At the very heart of the model, the engine pushing this incredibly fast timeline was this one core assumption of something called super exponential growth. So what on earth does that mean? It means the model assumed that every time AI capability doubled, the next doubling would happen 10% faster than the last one. It's not just acceleration, it's the acceleration of acceleration.
So here's how that actually plays out, right? You start with a doubling time of, say, 4.5 months. Then you just keep applying that 10% speed up again and again and again. And what you get isn't just fast growth. No, the inevitable result of that kind of math is a curve that just rockets straight up towards a mathematical infinity in a ridiculously short amount of time.
And this is where the model just goes completely off the rails. The critic asked the model for a prediction for the year 2030. The answer wasn't some unbelievably huge number. It was this, a negative and imaginary number. For anyone who's done some math, you know this is the equivalent of your calculator just flashing error. It means the model didn't just break, it had already shot past infinity and was just outputting complete nonsense.
But here's the part that'll really bake your noodle. The critic discovered that the sprint to infinity was just baked into the structure of the model itself. It had almost nothing to do with the actual data being fed in. To prove it, someone changed the starting input from 15 minutes to 15 nanoseconds, which is just an absurdly tiny number. The result? The model still predicted superintelligence would show up around 2027. The output was basically totally disconnected from the input.
And then came what might just be the single most damning discovery of all. The report talks about this sophisticated data fitting process they use to forecast a key milestone. It sounds all very scientific and rigorous, but when the critic looked at the actual code, he found that the model does the calculation and then is literally told to, and I'm quoting the code's comments here, throw this calculation in the trash and just use a number that the forecaster plugged in manually. The data-driven part? It was basically just for show. So you'd think that's game over, right? Case closed. Well, with all these massive flaws laid bare, how did the authors respond? They didn't just pack up and go home. To their credit, they really engaged with the critique, and they tried to frame this whole thing not as them just getting the math wrong, but as a much deeper, more philosophical disagreement about how you even try to forecast the future in the first place. And they started by making some really important concessions. They admitted that one of the most popular graphs they shared wasn't actually a good representation of their own model. They took out a pretty weak argument they'd made for that super exponential curve. They agreed that the whole rebench section was presented in a really misleading way. They even gave the critic a $500 bounty for finding all this stuff.
But this is where we get to the real heart of it. It boils down to a fundamental disagreement. The critics' position was, look, models have to be validated by strong data. The authors said, for something as wild as AGI, we have to try and model the dynamics even if the data isn't perfect. The critics said, you gotta stick to the data you have. The authors argued that expert, judgmental adjustments are actually crucial. And ultimately, their defense was, look, this model might have issues, but it's the least bad model we have. And just by publishing it, we're pushing the conversation forward. And this quote from one of the authors, Eli Lifland, just perfectly sums up their final position. He said, we continue to think that AI 2027's timeline's forecast is, unfortunately, the world's state of the art and challenge others to do better. I mean, despite all the valid criticism, they stood by it as the best attempt out there. And they basically threw down the gauntlet and said, hey, if you think you can build a better one, go for it.
But the story doesn't stop in the West. The report's journey over to China and how it was interpreted and changed over there adds this whole other fascinating layer to the saga. It shows how a technical debate can get all tangled up in geopolitics and censorship.
Okay, so to get this, you have to look at the timeline in the original story. It was deeply geopolitical. It had China consolidating all its AI research, Chinese intelligence stealing American tech, the US achieving AGI first, and then ultimately a Chinese AI system betraying its own country to a more powerful US AGI. It was a very specific and very provocative narrative.
Right. But when that same timeline showed up in mainstream Chinese media outlets, it looked pretty different. Notice anything missing? Yeah, all the juicy, politically sensitive stuff, the US-China race, the spying, the AI betrayal, poof, it was all surgically removed. You're left with this completely vanilla, depoliticized version of the story.
And when researchers actually studied how the report was received in China, they found this was a super consistent pattern. The most likely reason wasn't some government official directly redacting it, but something more subtle, self-censorship. The editors and writers just knew what lines they couldn't cross and removed the sensitive content themselves.
So, the reaction was totally different depending on where you looked. Mainstream media gave you the sanitized version, but on forums like Jihu, which is kind of like their Quora, the discussions were completely unfiltered. And a lot of people were criticizing what they saw as an anti-China bias in the report. And what's really interesting is that some bloggers found a clever way around the censorship. They just framed the report as science fiction. That label gave them the freedom to talk about the more sensitive parts. For analysts, this is key. The pattern of what gets censored and what doesn't could actually be a valuable signal for how the Chinese government is really thinking about the AGI race.
So, after all that, the viral story, the deep dive critique, the philosophical defense, the geopolitical censorship, what's the real lesson here? This whole saga tells us something really profound about what forecasting is all about, and it goes way beyond just being right or wrong.
If you boil it all down, there are three crucial lessons. First, the incredible power of narrative. A good story can make any data, no matter how shaky, unbelievably persuasive and viral. Second, the massive value of open criticism. The authors said hundreds of people reviewed their report, but it took one dedicated critic digging into the code to find the fatal flaws. And third, the human element. This whole story is just a powerful reminder that every complex model, every forecast is ultimately built on a foundation of very human assumptions, judgments, and beliefs.
Which kind of leaves us with this final big question. When we build these incredibly elaborate models to try and predict the future, are we actually building a telescope to see what's coming, or are we just constructing a really complicated mirror, one that in the end only reflects our own hopes, our own fears, and our own assumptions right back at us?